The hospice nurse called me at 6:40 in the morning to say my mother had passed peacefully in her sleep an hour earlier. I was standing in my kitchen in Portland with the phone pressed to my ear, and I told her that was impossible because my mother was asleep down the hall in my guest room, and I had checked on her at 5 when I got up to let the dog out. There was a long pause on the line. Then the nurse said, very gently, "Ma'am, your mother's been a patient at Cedar Grove in Sacramento for 11 weeks. I sat with her last night. Before I tell you what I found when I opened that guest room door, do me a favor and hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let me start at the beginning. My name is Claire. I'm 33, and until that morning I would have told you I had a pretty good handle on my life. I work as a dental hygienist 3 days a week. I've got a rescue mutt named Biscuit, and for the past 2 months I've been caring for my mother, who had moved up from California to live with me after her cancer diagnosis got bad enough that living alone wasn't safe anymore. At least, that's what I believed. My mom and I had always been close, but in that complicated way a lot of mothers and daughters are. She was a proud woman. Worked 30 years as a school administrator, raised me mostly on her own after my dad left, and she did not like asking for help. So when she called me back in February and said the doctors in Sacramento had given her a timeline and asked, in this small voice I'd never heard her use, if she could come stay with me, I said yes before she even finished the sentence. She showed up in March with 2 suitcases and a folder full of medical records. Thin, tired, but still her. Still the woman who corrected my grammar and reorganized my spice rack within the first hour of arriving. I set her up in the guest room, hired a part-time homemaid for the days I worked, and we settled into a routine. Mornings were oatmeal and the crossword. Afternoons she'd nap. Evenings we'd watch old movies, the kind they don't make anymore, and she'd fall asleep before the end, and I'd cover her with the quilt my grandmother made. It was the closest we'd been in years. I'd lie awake some nights and feel guilty for being almost grateful that the illness had brought her back to me. So you can imagine what that phone call did to me. I stood there in my kitchen, Biscuit circling my feet, and I actually laughed. A nervous, disbelieving little laugh. I told the nurse she had the wrong number, the wrong patient, the wrong everything. My mother was 40 feet away from me. I'd heard her cough in the night. I'd brought her tea at 5. "What's your mother's name?" the nurse asked. "Margaret Donnelly," I said. Another pause. "That's our patient," she said softly. "Date of birth?" I gave it. June 14th, 1956. It matched. Everything matched. I hung up. I don't even remember saying goodbye. I just walked down the hall on legs that didn't feel like mine, and I stood outside the guest room door with my hand on the knob, and for the first time in my life I was afraid to see my own mother. I opened the door. She was sitting up in bed, reading glasses on, working the crossword in the lamplight. She looked up and smiled at me and said, "You're up early, sweetheart. Everything all right? And I want you to understand something. It was her. Same gray-streaked hair pinned back the way she always wore it. Same reading glasses on the same beaded chain. Same little mole below her left ear. Same voice. When she said sweetheart, it landed in my chest the exact way it had my whole life. "I'm fine, Mom," I heard myself say. "Just the dog." "That dog runs your life," she said, and went back to the crossword. I closed the door and stood in the hallway, and I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. I leaned against the wall and tried to breathe. There had to be an explanation, a clerical error. 2 patients with the same name and birthday. Hospitals make mistakes. People get mixed up in the system all the time. That's what I told myself. But I'm a logical person. So that afternoon, while she napped, I called Cedar Grove back. I asked them to describe their patient. The woman on the phone, a different one this time, told me Margaret Donnelly had been admitted in March, was in end-stage care, and had a daughter listed as next of kin. A daughter named Claire. "That's me," I said. "I'm Claire, but my mother is here. In Oregon, with me." The woman went quiet for a moment and then said she'd have a social worker call me back. I didn't tell my mother. I don't know why exactly, except that some animal part of my brain told me not to. I made dinner that night, chicken and rice, her favorite, and I watched her eat it and laugh at something on the television. And the whole time my heart was going like a hammer. Because the thing is, she was perfect. She remembered things. She remembered the name of my 3rd-grade teacher. She remembered the trip we took to the coast when I was 9 and the seagull that stole my sandwich. She remembered things I'd half forgotten myself. How do you doubt someone who carries your childhood inside them? The social worker called the next morning while I was at work. Her name was Denise, and she had a kind, careful voice, the voice of someone who delivers hard news for a living. She confirmed it again. Margaret Donnelly, their patient, was actively dying. She'd been in their care since spring. And then she said something that made the floor tilt under me. "Claire, I need to ask, have you spoken to your mother on the phone or seen her in person since March?" "I've seen her every single day," I said. "She lives with me." "The woman living with you," Denise said slowly. "How did she come to live with you?" And I started to answer, and then I stopped, because the truth was, I hadn't gone to get her. My mother had said she'd arranged everything, a friend was driving her up, and she'd shown up at my door one afternoon with her suitcases. I'd hugged her on the porch. I'd been so happy to see her I hadn't questioned a single thing. I told Denise I'd call her back. That night I did something I'm not proud of. I waited until my mother was asleep, and I went into the guest room as quietly as I could, and I took the folder of medical records off her nightstand. I brought it into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub and went through it page by page. It was all there. Diagnosis, treatment history, doctor's notes. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. The letterhead was from a clinic I'd never heard of. The doctor's signature was a scrawl, and on the third page, a photocopy of an insurance card was a name that wasn't my mother's. The card said, M. Donnelly, yes. But the policy number, when I looked closer, the address listed was here. My address. In Portland, a policy that had been opened in April, after she'd arrived. My mother had moved to Oregon in 1956, according to one document. In 1956, she would have been a newborn. The dates didn't line up anywhere. It was a folder built to look real to someone who wasn't looking hard. I sat on that bathroom floor until my legs went numb. The next day, I did something even worse, and I'd do it again. I called my mother's oldest friend, my Aunt Rosa, who isn't really my aunt but has known my mom since they were teenagers in Sacramento. Rosa picked up on the second ring, and the second she heard my voice, she started crying. "Oh, honey," she said. "Oh, Claire, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. The number I had stopped working. I didn't know how to find you. Honey, your mother's been asking for you. She keeps asking why you won't come." I gripped the counter. "What are you talking about, Rosa? Mom's here. She's with me." The line went dead silent. "Claire," Rosa said, and her voice had changed completely. "Your mother is in a hospice in Sacramento. I visited her on Tuesday. She can barely speak now. She thinks you abandoned her." "Who is with you? Who is in your house?" I don't remember the rest of that call. I remember sliding down to the kitchen floor with Biscuit licking my face, and I remember the sound of the guest room door opening, and her voice calling out, "Claire, who are you talking to so early?" And for the first time, when she said my name, it didn't sound like love. It sounded like a hand reaching for something it wanted to hold on to. I told her it was a telemarketer. I made my voice normal. I made breakfast. And as I stood at the stove with my back to her, scrambling eggs I knew I couldn't eat, I started to understand that I was living in a house with a stranger who knew everything about me. And the realest, most terrifying question I'd ever asked formed in my mind. If my mother was dying alone 3 states away, then who had I been tucking in at night for 2 months? And how did she know about the seagull? I needed to think, and I couldn't think with her in the house. So I told her I had a double shift, kissed her on the forehead, the way I did every morning, and I felt sick doing it. Then I drove to a coffee shop across town, parked, and called Rosa back. This time I let her talk. What she told me unspooled slowly, and it was so much worse than I'd imagined. Rosa said that back in January, before the diagnosis got bad, my mother had hired a live-in companion to help her around the house in Sacramento. A woman in her 50s, warm, attentive, came with references. Her name was Vivian. My mother adored her. Told Rosa that Vivian was a godsend, that she didn't know what she'd do without her. Vivian cooked, cleaned, drove her to appointments, sat with her for hours. And Vivian asked questions, lots of questions, about the family, about me, about my mother's life, her house, her savings, her late husband, the trip to the coast, the seagull, all of it. My mother, lonely and frightened and grateful, told her everything. She loved telling stories about you, Rosa said, crying again. She'd talk about you for hours. That woman knew you better than your mother's own sister did because Maggie talked about nothing else. When the diagnosis turned terminal in March and my mother needed real medical care, she went into Cedar Grove. And Vivian, who had power of attorney over small daily matters by then, simply, quietly, vanished. Took the car. And Rosa suspected, took something else, because around that time my mother's account started showing withdrawals. Nobody could explain. I sat in my car and I felt the whole thing close around me like a fist. The woman in my guest room wasn't a confused stranger. She wasn't a hospital mix-up. She was Vivian. She had spent months studying my mother, learning her face, her hair, her voice, her mannerisms, her stories. And then she'd shown up at the door of the one person who had never met her, me, the estranged daughter who hadn't seen her own mother in over a year because of a stupid fight about money and pride. She'd shown up wearing my mother's life like a coat. And here's the part that made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. She hadn't come for nothing. My mother owned her house outright in Sacramento. There was a small inheritance from my grandmother. And there was a life insurance policy, a real one, that paid out to the daughter, to Claire, to me. Vivian didn't need my mother's money. She needed to be standing next to me, trusted and beloved, when my mother actually died, so that when the grief hit and the paperwork came, the daughter would sign whatever the loving woman beside her slid across the table. I thought about calling the police right then. I want to be honest with you about why I didn't, because I know that's the first thing you're thinking. I almost did. But I had a folder full of fake documents in my house and a woman who'd had 2 months to make herself look like the victim. She had keys to my house. She'd been getting mail there. There was an insurance policy in her false name with my address on it. If I called the cops and she was gone before they arrived, or worse, if she spun some story about a delusional daughter who couldn't accept her dying mother, I had nothing. No proof of who she really was. I'd look like the crazy one. And every cop show I'd ever seen taught me the same thing. You don't get one shot at this. You get one shot, and you'd better not waste it. So I made a decision in that coffee shop parking lot that I think probably saved everything. I was going to go home, and I was going to act like nothing had changed. And I was going to get the truth on a record nobody could argue with. The hardest acting of my life happened over the next 9 days. I went home that afternoon, and I smiled, and I asked her about the crossword. I made dinner. I sat through an old movie and let her fall asleep against my shoulder, and I lay awake every single night with my heart slamming, a stranger's breathing in the next room. During the days, while she napped or while I was at work, I built my case. I called Cedar Grove and arranged, through tears that were entirely real, to have my mother's care transferred into my name, and to fly down. I talked to Denise, the social worker, who put me in touch with a detective in Sacramento named Officer Reyes, because it turned out my mother wasn't the first lonely, dying woman this had happened to. Vivian had a pattern. Different name each time. Reyes had a thin file and no face to put to it. I had the face. In my guest room, drinking my tea, I started recording. On my phone, in my pocket, I'd bring up the past, gently fishing. And one night, while she was tired and the wine had loosened her, I asked her to tell me again about the day I was born. And she told me a beautiful story, detailed and warm, and it was completely wrong. Wrong hospital. Wrong season. My mother had told me 100 times I was born in a snowstorm in December. Vivian put me in July. She'd learned everything except the one thing my mother had been too sick by the end to repeat. She'd run out of Seagull. I had it. On tape. A woman claiming to be my mother, getting my own birth wrong. I flew Officer Reyes a copy of everything. The recordings, the fake folder, the insurance policy, Rose's statement, the dates. And then I did the last thing. I told the woman in my guest room that my mother's old lawyer was coming to the house to finalize some paperwork about the estate, since Mom was here and feeling well enough to sign. Her eyes lit up. I will never forget how her eyes lit up. The lawyer was real. So were the 2 plainclothes officers who came with him, and Officer Reyes on a video call from Sacramento, and a hospice administrator who had cared for my real mother for 11 weeks and could identify her on sight. We sat at my dining room table, the same table where she'd corrected my grammar and reorganized my life. The lawyer slid the papers across. She picked up the pen, my mother's reading glasses perched on her nose. And I said, "Before you sign, I'd like my actual mother to join us. She's on the call." I turned my laptop around, and there, in a hospice bed in Sacramento, frail and barely conscious, but unmistakably achingly real, was my mother. Margaret Donnelly. My mom. The woman at my table went white. The pen rolled out of her fingers. She stood up, and she got maybe one word out before Officer Reyes said her real name through the speaker, and the two officers stood up too, and there was nowhere in my little house for her to go. She was arrested at my dining room table. The fake reading glasses were still on the chain around her neck. I flew to Sacramento that same night. I made it to Cedar Grove at 2 a.m, and they let me in even though it wasn't visiting hours, because the nurse who'd called me that first day, her name was Anne, recognized my voice on the intercom. She walked me down a quiet hall, and she opened a door, and there was my mother. I'd wasted over a year being too proud to call. She'd spent her last lucid weeks believing I didn't want her. I climbed into that narrow bed beside her, and I held her hand, the real one, thinner than I remembered. And I told her I was sorry, and I told her I was there, and I told her about the seagull. She couldn't really speak anymore, but she squeezed my hand. I felt it. She knew. She passed 4 days later with me holding that same hand. The woman who tried to wear my mother's life is facing charges in 3 states now. Reyes calls me sometimes with updates. But I don't think much about her, to be honest. I think about the 11 weeks I lost and the 4 days I got back and how close I came to never opening that door at all. The hardest part wasn't the woman at my dining room table. It was the year before all of it, the year I let pride do my talking for me. My mother, Margaret, and I had a fight about money, and I let that fight stretch into months of silence, and those months turned into the open door a stranger walked through. Vivian didn't break into my life. I left it unlocked. She found a daughter who hadn't picked up the phone, and a mother so starved for her child's voice that she handed over every story she had. Cause and effect, plain as anything. The distance I created became the exact shape someone else stepped into and filled. I think about that a lot now. Every choice I made in those 11 weeks, good and bad, led somewhere. When I chose not to call the police in a panic, when I sat on that bathroom floor and made myself look at the dates instead of screaming, that clear thinking was the only reason any of it worked. If I'd reacted instead of reasoned, she'd have vanished and I'd have looked like the unstable one. Slowing down when everything in me wanted to run, that was the smartest thing I ever did, and it didn't come naturally. I had to choose it. But thinking clearly only mattered because I refused to look away from the truth, even when the truth made me complicit. It would have been easier to believe the comforting version, that she was a sweet, confused woman, that I was overreacting. Honesty meant admitting my own part. It meant calling Rosa and hearing that my mother thought I'd abandoned her and not flinching from how true that almost was. You can't fix what you won't, honestly name, and naming it cost me something every single time. And then there was just the holding on. 9 days of acting normal across the table from someone wearing my mother's face. 2 a.m. at Cedar Grove, climbing into a narrow bed to hold a hand barely had strength left to squeeze mine. Nobody tells you that doing the right thing is mostly endurance. Mostly showing up one more time when you're empty. I wanted to collapse 100 times. I didn't, because Margaret was 3 states away believing I didn't want her, and I was not going to let that be the last thing she knew. So if you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Don't let pride decide who you talk to, because silence is a door, and someone is always willing to walk through it. Stay clear-headed when life turns strange, because panic is loud and the truth is quiet. And when the right thing turns out to be long and exhausting instead of dramatic and quick, stay anyway. I got 4 days with my real mother. I almost got none. The difference was that I chose to keep my head, tell myself the truth, and not stop walking down that hospital hall, no matter how late it was.